Hello, my name is Dr. Susan Robbins. The class you're watching is Drugs in Society. You know the drill, folks. Say hello to future viewing audiences. Say hi. Okay, today I'm very glad we have here with us today the folks from the Drug Policy Forum of Texas, of which I am currently the vice president. And they're going to be talking about the Drug Policy Forum of Texas. And I'd like to introduce each one of them. They're each going to be speaking individually, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. So we're going to be meeting today Dr. Al Robison, to my immediate right. He is a distinguished professor of pharmacology and a retired professor and chair of the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. He is also the co-founder of the Drug Policy Forum of Texas. Next to him is Susie Wills, who is a retired CPA who has special interests in the historical and economic aspects of the drug war. Her interest started in the 1960s when she was a teenager and the drug war was beginning. She's the drug policy chair of the League of Women Voters of Dallas, and she's also a board member of the Drug Policy Forum of Texas and coordinator of our Speaker Bureau. Next to Susie is Gerry Epstein, who's a Rice University graduate in history, and he has a University of Houston graduate degree in sociology. He's a former Marine Corps officer, former IBM employee, and also one of the co-founders of the Drug Policy Forum of Texas. And finally, to his right.
Pardon?
To his right. That's it. We're getting there. Oh, we have Gerry in the background. That's okay. This is Dr. Richard Evans. He's a Rice University graduate, also a graduate of Tulane Medical School. He trains in surgical oncology, and he has had an interest in the drug war since 1989. He's one of the past presidents of the Drug Policy Forum of Texas and currently is on the board of the Drug Policy Forum of Texas. So please, let's welcome all of them. Thank you. We're going to start today with Dr. Al Robison, who's going to talk a little bit about how and why he founded the Drug Policy Forum of Texas, and also talk about some of the research that he has done in the past with marijuana.
Okay. Well, that's what Dr. Robbins asked me to talk about, and I'll try to do that. I have to first admit that for most of my scientific career, I was a bit of a workaholic, and I never took the slightest interest in public policy of any kind, and in particular, drug policy. Until I came to Texas to take the job of the head of pharmacology at the new medical school, then new medical school. And the faculty was so small back then that we all had to do 6,000 different jobs, and I got put on the admissions committee. And that was quite an eye-opener for me, because that is when I first realized that it was a felony in Texas to be caught with any amount of marijuana, and the punishment was 2 years to life imprisonment, depending on how much pot you got caught with. Now, this was a gigantic problem for our applicants, because many of them came from here, University of Houston and University of Texas, and everywhere else in Texas and elsewhere. And I'm sure you must remember that 1972 was just the rear end of the 60s, and I'm sure that 99% of every Texas student back then had at least tried pot. And some of them had got caught. Now, in retrospect, I honestly can't imagine these upper-class kids ever spending 2 days in jail, never mind 2 years. But still, they had a felony on their record, and that was what bothered them, because you can't practice medicine in Texas or most other states if you have been convicted of a felony. So their question to me was, well, should I even bother applying? I mean, because assuming I graduate, I'm doomed. I can't. I won't be able to practice medicine. So that really did wake me up, and I told these guys, well, damn, I'll look into it for you and see what happened. And that actually led to a lot of interesting correspondence with the senator, whose name I'm blocking on. I'm getting old and my memory is not as good as it used to be. But they named a highway after him anyway. And he was a vice presidential candidate. But anyway, it's beside the point. It so happens that the Texas Senate back then, and I think you may have actually covered that if you had a history of prohibition. Did Dr. Buford Terrell talk about that? They began to realize that the state of Texas was nothing but a bunch of potential felons walking around. And so the Senate got upset about that and looked into it and came up with a very interesting report, which is still available on the internet. In any event, to make a long story short, changed possession of marijuana from a felony to a misdemeanor. And so the students got that off their record and everything was okay. But still, that shocked me enough so that I retained a certain interest in drug policy and didn't do anything about it for a long time, because it was, well, I found out when I first gave my very first talk many years later to a business group that you couldn't even talk about it in polite society, never mind a professor talking about it. So, but in 19, I guess I took the job in 1972, and by 1993 I had retired, so I could start talking about it, and I think it was 1995 that I read a letter by that guy, Gerry, who's going to talk to you tonight, Gerry Epstein, a wonderful letter in either the Houston Chronicle or the Houston Post, I can't remember. But it's such a good letter that I managed to find out how I could get in touch with Gerry, and the two of us met and decided that what we desperately needed was an organization that would at the very least make it possible to discuss drug policy. And that was really all we were aiming for to begin with. Now, the rest of these guys will talk about what happened subsequently, but now I suddenly realize what I was going to explain to you to begin with was why did that shock me so much? The realization that possessing a small amount of marijuana, cannabis, was a felony. And that's because some years earlier, when I was a researcher at Vanderbilt University, the active principle of marijuana, tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, had been isolated by a group of Israeli scientists, and the lab, my lab was out at Central State Hospital in Nashville, which was the state hospital for the insane back then. This is really out of the past because there is no such thing as a mental hospital anymore, but because of advances in drug therapy, actually, to be honest. But back then, we were one of the few groups of scientists who had a supply of this new material, THC, and so we were just charged with the responsibility of finding out what this thing did, with the real pharmacology of it. And my particular assignment was to find out what the LD50 of it was. In other words, how toxic is this substance? And the LD50 is defined as the dose at which 50% of a group of animals, mice or rats or cats or dogs or whatever you're using for your experimental animals, how much of this drug does it take to kill 50% of them? And that was quite an astounding thing for us because we could not find an LD50. In other words, no matter how much of this stuff we injected, you could not kill a mouse with it. Or, as I used to tell Rotary clubs and things when I talk about this, you couldn't kill anything with it. You couldn't kill cockroaches or nothing. You couldn't imagine a less useful industrial chemical. And so, I guess you guys can see now why it shocked me so much to come to Texas and realize that people were being sent to jail, to prison for this, ingesting this stuff. And here the medical students were the ones that put me onto this, and the medical students could walk 2 blocks in either direction and buy all of the really dangerous drugs, nicotine and, I mean, tobacco and alcohol, which really are dangerous drugs. There's no doubt that you take enough of those drugs and you'll die, or a mouse will. In fact, just to illustrate the craziness of the drug laws, I once calculated it's possible to take such a teeny amount of nicotine that you couldn't possibly see it with the naked eye and inject that into a mouse, and the mouse would die of very violent convulsions, poof, in a fraction of a second. I mean, so now you're talking about a dangerous drug, and here's the thing that people were put in prison for was this innocuous substance that I knew you couldn't kill a mouse with. So that's why I got so upset about this, and finally took a serious interest in public policy. So Gerry and I got together and we called a meeting of all the friends. Come to think of it, Dr. Robbins and Dr. Evans were 2 of my friends who I'd met over the years and happened to know they shared my view that these laws were crazy. And we got together quite a group of people, actually, something like 25 people by the time it was over, and we met at a restaurant and decided to start the Drug Policy Forum of Texas. And we were pretty naive back then. We thought if we could just convince people of the truth, eventually the laws would change. And, you know, as you presumably already know, we still have crazy drug laws on the books. It's not anywhere near as bad as it was before. Many states, as you'll learn later on, if you haven't already, many states, it's at least if you need it for medical use, you can get it. So things have changed a lot for the better. And so I think I'll be happy to participate in the panel discussion or anything else. But, Dr. Robbins did mention something that she wanted me to mention, which illustrates how ignorant people were of addicting drugs back in those days. Because we would even teach the medical students, in retrospect, a lot of nonsense. Such as, for example, a belief that I firmly had that if you ever got addicted to heroin, that was it. There's no use even thinking about anything else. And the person who got addicted to heroin was just doomed. And of course, I realize now that there were intelligent people who knew better, but it was not until the veterans started coming back from Vietnam that it became widely recognized that heroin was not so bad. If the heroin addict had a decent home life to go back to, he would recover quite nicely. And we now realize that even cocaine is not as addicting as tobacco and nicotine. That's the most addicting of all. And most of them don't cause any trouble compared to alcohol. So the drug laws are still extremely nutty, but not as bad as they were at one time. So Susie Wills, she got introduced, so here's Susie. She was a pretty early member of the Drug Policy Forum of Texas.
I've been asked to talk about our Speakers Bureau at DPFT and the special interest that benefit from keeping the drug laws the way they are, European drug policy, and other organizations that have positions on drug policy. So expect some kind of abrupt changes in topic tonight. You can put up the slide. It has DPFT's mission. One way that DPFT fulfills its mission is by providing speakers to organizations like Rotary, Kiwanis, Lions Club. We have spoken to literally hundreds of groups in Texas, mostly in the large population centers. This next year, Senator McSorley, who carried the medical marijuana bill in the New Mexico legislature, has agreed to give talks for us in Texas. And of course, we're pleased about this opportunity, and I am particularly hoping that we can get him before some audiences in West Texas, where we have not been able to reach. Crime bills and drug laws are passed the same way that all other laws are passed, with heavy influence from special interest lobbyists and their money. In 2009, congressional lobbyists spent $3.5 billion. That's $22 million for each day that Congress was in session. The special interests that benefit from the drug war are formidable. In 2000, Congress overwhelmingly passed a $1.3 billion bill, Plan Colombia, ostensibly to stop Colombian heroin and cocaine from reaching the U.S. market. An amendment to divert $400 million to drug treatment was soundly defeated, in spite of the fact that a RAND Corporation study had just found that dollar for dollar, drug treatment is 10 times more effective in stopping drug use than is interdiction. Plan Colombia provided $1.1 billion to buy helicopters and $200 million to spray crops with glyphosate. There had been no public outcry demanding that Congress involve us in Colombia's 38-year-old civil war. Support for Plan Colombia came from lobbyists working for Bell Helicopter, Sikorsky Helicopter, Occidental Petroleum. The only real discussion that took place in Congress was over whose helicopters to buy, Bell's or Sikorsky's. In the end, Congress voted to buy some of each and keep both sets of lobbyists happy. Fumigation in the Andean region has increased steadily. the Colombian government halted the eradication for about a year over our strong objection. According to them, 12% of the acreage that we sprayed was coca. 88% was food crops. Over 8,000 complaints have been filed over erroneous fumigation of food crops. A resolution presented to the American Medical Association said the spraying is causing widespread illnesses, destroying pastures, destroying food crops, poisoning livestock, displacing thousands of small farmers, and killing birds, mammals, aquatic life, and natural plants. $104 million was approved for the Colombian military in our 2002 budget, and provisions that required that our funds be limited to counter narcotics activities were lifted. $98 million was specifically allocated to training a brigade of the Colombian military to guard Occidental Petroleum's Cañon Limón pipeline from rebel attacks. That amounts to a subsidy of about $3 per barrel for oil carried by that pipeline. In 2005, the Congressional Research Service reported that $5.4 billion had been spent on the Andean counter-drug initiative. 800 U.S. troops had been authorized, and 600 U.S. civilian contractors had been authorized. They also reported that while there had been measurable progress in Colombia's internal security, there had been no effect with regard to the price, purity, or availability of cocaine and heroin in the United States. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reported that over 96,000 hectares of coca bush was manually eradicated, and over 133,000 hectares was sprayed in 2008. However, coca bush cultivation was up in Bolivia and Peru. Over 400 metric tons of cocaine production was available from those countries. Influenced by the same set of lobbyists and the Mexican government and the senators from the states where the helicopters are built, Texas and Connecticut, Congress approved the Merida Initiative in 2008. $1.4 billion will be paid to Mexico over 3 years for helicopters, surveillance aircraft, night vision scanners, and other equipment. A very small amount is allocated for human rights training and judicial reforms. In spite of concerns about corruption in the Calderon administration and allegations of torture, beatings, illegal raids, and arrest, this money has continued to be paid. In December of 2009, $360 million was paid, including delivery of 5 Bell helicopters to Mexico. The pharmaceutical industry is a huge player in the drug war. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is the Johnson & Johnson fortune, provides almost all the funding for the Partnership for Drug-Free America. They provided $15 million in 1999 and another $5 million in 2006. The directors emeritus of the Partnership for Drug-Free America are James Burke, who is retired chairman of Johnson & Johnson, and his brother, Daniel Burke, who's retired president of ABC Inc. The Partnership for Drug-Free America is a Section 501c3 tax-exempt organization, but it's proud of its influence on Congress. Of 14 institutional donors of $50,000 or more in 2008, 8 are pharmaceutical corporations, foundations, or PACs. Modern pharmaceutical corporations are among the most profitable in the United States. That is not just because they make a needed product. The pharmaceutical industry spends more money lobbying Congress than any other industry. It employs twice as many lobbyists as there are members of Congress. About a third of them are former federal officials. In debate on the Senate floor, Richard Durbin has said the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America lobby has a death grip on Congress. The industry also spends millions of dollars lobbying state governments to prevent adoption of programs that would reduce spending on prescription drugs. The CEOs of pharmaceutical corporations are among the most highly paid executives in the world. Much of their money comes from stock and stock options. The value of Eli Lilly shares fell $35 billion in one day when a court ruled that a generic version could compete with Prozac in a year. GlaxoSmithKline got 9 new patents on Paxil, which is another antidepressant, and filed 5 lawsuits to delay generic competition. The company estimated for every day it avoided competition, it earned $4.4 million. Cannabis was removed from the Pharmacopoeia in 1941 over the objections of the American Medical Association. At the time, it was listed in the medical literature as useful for over 100 conditions. It effectively treats problems as divergent as multiple sclerosis, migraine headaches, nausea, insomnia, glaucoma, Crohn's disease, spasticity, and nail patella syndrome. Research has shown that it's effective against certain types of cancer. It would compete with literally hundreds of pharmaceutical products for pennies on the dollar. According to surveys in Australia and at the University of California, 2/3 of people who use marijuana for medical reasons significantly decrease or stop taking their pharmaceutical products altogether. The DEA places marijuana in Schedule 1, saying it has no medical use. However, the Department of Health and Human Services holds a patent on cannabinoids and says that they are effective in treating a wide variety of diseases, including stroke, trauma, autoimmune disorders, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and HIV dementia. 3 easily patentable cannabinoids have been approved by the FDA, either for testing or use. The National Institute on Drug Abuse controls the only legal source of marijuana in this country. It has repeatedly refused to allow its marijuana to be used by researchers, effectively blocking research in this country. The agency's director has justified this by saying it is not NIDA's mission to study the medical uses of marijuana. For many years, a bizarre Orwellian relationship existed between the Drug Czar's office, the Partnership for Drug-Free America, the advertising industry, and the media. In 1996, California voted to allow its patients to use marijuana as a medicinal herb. That same year, Arizona voted to allow its physicians to prescribe any drug that they saw fit, regardless of federal law. 9 days later, the drug czar, who at the time was General Barry McCaffrey, convened a meeting in his offices. The purpose of this meeting was to find a way to spend money to stop the other 48 states from following California and Arizona. This required finesse because at the time, as a federal agency, the Czar's office was legally prohibited from interfering with the legislative processes of the states. As an organization that accepts tax-deductible money, the Partnership for Drug-Free America is legally prohibited from interfering in legislative and political causes. 11 months after this meeting, the Czar's office announced that it would buy $775 million in advertising over the next 5 years from TV networks, magazines, newspapers, and internet providers. For each ad that was purchased, the medium would be required to donate an additional ad. However, it could be freed from this onerous obligation and sell the lucrative TV time and ad space if it ran satisfactory on-strategy messages in its editorials, articles, or in the content of its programs. As the campaign unfolded, the Czar's office provided $22 million in financial incentives to TV networks for government-vetted anti-drug scripts. This same financial credit for content paradigm was in place at some of the nation's most prominent, supposedly nonfiction magazines. This scheme continued until the Federal Communications Commission ruled, in response to a lawsuit filed by Normal, that the Czar's office must identify itself as an advertising sponsor. The Czar's office still continues to hold seminars for TV and movie writers to help them develop script ideas. In 2002, the Czar's office began the National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign. This was a series of anti-drug ads produced mostly by the Partnership for Drug-Free America. Over the next 6 years, Congress provided over $1 billion to the media campaign, making the Czar's office one of the country's largest advertisers, and these ads the single largest public service initiative in the history of advertising. The National Institutes on Drug Abuse issued 2 reports saying that the ads did not keep kids from using drugs. In fact, it promoted drug use among girls and younger teens. Congress cut the budget for the media campaign from about $100 million in 2007 to $60 million in 2008 and $20 million in 2009. And support from advertisers followed the same pattern. Support for the Partnership for Drug-Free America. In his chilling book, Going Up the River, Joseph Hallinan says, "Having failed to make prisons effective, we have learned to make them profitable." The United States has the largest prison system in the world. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. Over 2 million people are imprisoned. 1,000 inmates are added every week. Another 2 million people are employed catching law violators and keeping them behind bars. We spend $200 billion a year on local, state, and federal enforcement and prison personnel. The prison industry does more than $1 billion a year in business. It has its own trade shows, conventions, websites, catalogs, and direct marketing campaigns. The firms involved include some of the nation's largest architectural and construction firms. Investment banks handle prison bond issues and investments in private prisons. Other companies that do business with prisons include camera, technology companies, plumbing supply companies, telephone companies, food service companies, healthcare companies, and companies that sell padded cells and many other products. This is strong incentive to maintain and expand the prison system. Prisons are perceived as an economic boon in small towns. Working as a corrections officer is one of the few ways that undereducated people can earn a middle-class living there. Federal money for Medicaid, foster care, adoption assistance, and social service block grants, as well as congressional and legislative representation, is based on the census. Inmates count as residents of the county where they are incarcerated, not where their homes are. Conversely, this money and representation is lost to the inmates' home communities, which are concentrated in economically undeveloped areas of large cities. Constructing and operating prisons is not the only way to profit from them. In 1995, U.S. Technologies, a PC board assembler, closed its plant in Austin and fired its 150 employees. It reopened 45 days later as Lockhart Technologies in a facility at least for $1 a year in the prison at Lockhart, Texas. Lockhart Technologies pays minimum wage to the inmates, but the GEO Group, which is a private prison operator, takes 80% of their pay. Other companies that outsource jobs to prisons include some of the nation's largest corporations that we all do business with. Federal wage and safety standards do not apply to prison labor. None of these corporations have programs to hire ex-felons after their release. Some have policies that bar hiring them. More than half the states utilize private prisons. Over 100,000 Americans are held in prison for profit, and the number continues to grow. The guards and prison officials are often shareholders with incentive to hold down costs and oppose early release. Texas has the highest number of prisoners held in private facilities. Corrections Corporation of America is the largest private prison operator in the country. It has 13 prisons in Texas. It built 3 prisons in California on spec. Its chairman once bragged that 38 of 46 crime bills passed the California legislature due to its lobbying. This included 3 strikes. In 1996, the Prison Guards Union was the only organized opposition to medical marijuana, to passing the medical marijuana initiative in California. In 2008, it spent $2 million opposing Proposition 8, which would have required the diversion of non-violent drug law violators to drug treatment. Since the enactment of mandatory minimum sentencing for drug users, the Federal Bureau of Prisons budget is increased by over 2,500%. The Federal Amber Alert Bill includes unrelated provisions that limit judicial discretion in sentencing even further and allows the Justice Department to monitor judges who impose sentences that are below the guidelines. The Supreme Court has ruled that mandatory minimum sentencing is unconstitutional, and judges should only use these as guidelines. However, they have stuck very closely to the sentences. The argument for building more prisons goes like this. If crime is going up, we need to build more prisons. If crime is going down, it's because we built prisons, and we should build even more prisons to reduce crime further. This argument ignores several things. Once released, prisoners are sicker, angrier, and more alienated from their communities. They are undereducated, unskilled, and emotionally ill-equipped to deal with life in the free world. Even the lowest paying jobs are very difficult to obtain with a prison record. Federal laws impose a temporary ban on student loans and grants and a lifetime ban on food stamps and welfare for people convicted of even one drug felony. The most accurate predictor of who winds up in prison is who has a parent who did time in prison. About 7 million American children have a parent somewhere in the criminal justice system. They are 5 times more likely to one day be incarcerated than children whose parents have never been imprisoned. More imprisonment does not equal more safety. Other countries have a higher degree of public safety than we do and imprison a much smaller percentage of their population. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration on earth, over 750 per 100,000. It is incumbent upon us to know who our 2 million prisoners are. They are overwhelmingly poor. 70% are illiterate. Less than 50% have been convicted of a violent crime. 52% of federal prisoners are nonviolent drug law violators. 20% of state prisoners are nonviolent drug law violators. At least 500,000 of our prisoners are seriously mentally ill. Many are kept in solitary isolation units, euphemistically called administrative segregation. The fastest growing segment of the prison population is women. American women are incarcerated at 10 times the rate of European women. 2/3 of female prisoners are incarcerated for a nonviolent offense. According to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, 70% of regular drug users are white. Drug users almost always report that they buy their drugs from someone of their own race. Yet 2/3 of people incarcerated for drug offenses are African American or Latino. In the United States, blacks are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of whites. Studies show that blacks are treated more harshly than whites at every stage of the legal process, from police stops to parole. The largest employer in the state of Texas is the state itself, with over 400,000 employees. The largest segment of the state workforce is prison workers. There are about 38,000 of them. In 2009, Texas had over 155,000 prisoners. That's about 630 per 100,000 population. In 1970, Texas had 128 prisoners per 100,000 population. Nearly 800,000 Texans are under some form of criminal justice control. From 1978 to 2004, the Texas inmate population rose by nearly 600%, while the population of the state rose at about 70%. The crime rate is decreased in Texas, but not as much as in some other states, which have not increased prison capacity as much as we have. The prison population decreased slightly in 2009 due to improved parole practices. 49% of Texas prisoners are nonviolent. 19% are nonviolent drug law violators. 34% of new receives last year were nonviolent drug law violators. 32% of female prisoners are nonviolent drug law violators. The average grade level, the average educational skill is a grade level of about the 8th grade. More than 30% of our prisoners are mentally ill. About half the men and 2/3 of the women are parents of minor children. 37% of Texas prisoners are black. The black community is by far the most impacted by incarceration. 74% of Texas inmates held for nonviolent drug law violations are people of color. Other countries take a different approach to drug policy. In 1994, the Swiss instituted a program of giving injectable doses of heroin to addicts at certified medical centers. After 3 years, crime among the addicts was down by 60%. Half the unemployed had found jobs. No one was homeless, and the general health of the group had improved dramatically. There are now 25 participating clinics. There have been no drug-related deaths among this group of addicts. A referendum has been held on whether or not to make the program permanent. It was approved with over a 70% majority. Swiss property insurance companies are among the most ardent supporters of the program because claims in the areas around the clinics have decreased significantly. The head of the Swiss police has called this the best crime-fighting program he's ever seen. During 2000, the Swiss clinics distributed 55 pounds of pure heroin. It cost $128,000. On the illegal market, that heroin would have brought traffickers and possibly terrorists $3.7 million. Several European countries have started treatment programs based on the Swiss model and made other significant reforms, such as decriminalizing some or all drugs. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001. They used the money saved on law enforcement for education and medical treatment. Their results have been very positive. 14 U.S. states have decriminalized possession of marijuana. Not all mainstream organizations support the drug war. In 2001, the King County, Washington Bar Association began a drug policy study. They determined that any drug policy should have these objectives: enhanced public order and reduced crime, improved public health, protection of children, efficient use of scarce public resources. Their report found that the war on drugs has not only failed to fulfill these objectives, but has exacerbated the very problems it was designed to address. In 2005, that Bar Association resolved that distribution of drugs should be regulated by the state of Washington. It was joined in its resolution by a number of mainstream organizations in Washington. Numerous religious groups have taken positions on drug policy, mostly opposing mandatory minimum sentencing and in favor of allowing use of cannabis as a medicinal herb. Medical associations have called for removing criminal penalties regarding cannabis in medical practice. The United States Conference of Mayors has called for a public health approach to drug policy and more decision-making at the local level. The League of Women Voters of Texas has studied drug policy and taken a position in favor of a public health approach to drug problems, supporting sterile syringe problems, and allowing use of cannabis as a medicinal herb. Recently, the El Paso City Council unanimously passed a resolution to ask the federal government for an honest, open national debate on ending prohibition of narcotics. They recanted after being lobbied by all their state and federal representatives who warned them that funding for law enforcement and other important programs would be put in jeopardy. This incident illustrates exactly why reform in this area is so difficult. Thanks for your attention tonight. If you'd like to look at those slides again or refer to anything else I've said, that it is on our website.
And we're going to go to break. Hello, we're back from break. What I want to do for just a minute is tell you a little bit about how I got associated with this group of folks, and this was back in the early to mid-90s. I was teaching a class on drugs, and lo and behold, there's an article in the Houston Chronicle, apparently, or a letter to the editor, I don't remember which, and this was the height, one of the many heights of drug scares in Texas and in the U.S. And somebody had written either an article or a letter to the editor saying, cocaine is the worst drug possible. You simply cannot compare marijuana to cocaine. There's no way to do that. Both drugs are equally dangerous, and how silly to try to compare. Somebody was trying to compare marijuana to cocaine. And it was a very stringent, strident article that said you simply cannot compare drugs. I read a letter to the editor written by Dr. Al Robinson that said, nonsense. I'm a pharmacologist. That's what pharmacologists do. We compare drugs all the time in terms of how dangerous they are, how lethal they are. And he gave some really good examples in his letter to the editor. It was, again, I don't remember either the Houston Chronicle or the Houston Post, which existed back then. And I said to myself after reading Dr. Robinson's letter, incredible, this is somebody I need to meet. So I called him and arranged to meet with him. And I did meet with him, and he then we had a very nice talk, and he also referred me to somebody named Dr. Malcolm Skolnick, who's one of the lecturers in this class. And they said to me, we're teaching a class on drugs over here at the UT Health Science Center. It was back then housed in the School of Biomedical Sciences, graduate level class. We would like to invite you to come on and be one of our lecturers. And what did I talk about? Treatment, because that's what social workers do. At the time, Carlo Di Clemente of Prochaska and Clemente was one of the professors here at U of H, and he did a whole section on prevention. So I joined this very illustrative group, and that class started there, and then it morphed into a class over here over the years. So that's how, and they did not have to strong-arm me very much, but I became a member, one of the founding members of the Drug Policy Forum of Texas, because I had met people who were like-minded in thinking, we need to talk about this. The idea, as Dr. Robinson said earlier, the fact that you couldn't even bring this up in polite discussion. At the height of the war on drugs, at the height of the media campaigns, not that this is now still going on, but it was almost verboten, forbidden to even talk about illegal drugs in any rational way. The party line is these drugs are dangerous, they're illegal, and they have to stay illegal, and we have to have harsher and harsher penalties. And I finally met a group of people, educated professionals, who in fact were interested in not only discussing this, but discussing the policy implications. So I was very pleased not only to become a part of this group, but to become a part of that class, and that class is what has morphed into this class. And I'm very thankful that this year, in 2010, we have almost all of the same lecturers in the class that we had back then, with the exception of a few people who have passed away and a couple of people who are retired. So again, I want to thank the group, and now we're going to hear from Gerry Epstein, you are the current president, is that correct?
Yeah.
Current president of DPFT. Go to the PowerPoint for 1 second, Don. So you spelled their names right, and you know who these folks are. I've given you their names on this PowerPoint. And now we're going to go over to Gerry Epstein. Back away from the PowerPoint.
Thank you, Susan. One of the curious things about all this is that I have no interest in drugs, or almost always never have had. My sole question has been, do you want your drugs with drug lords, or do you want your drugs without drug lords? That's it. That, to me, is the only question that exists in drug policy today. So what does that imply? Well, the focus and centerpiece of all drug policy says that we are going to, what?
Eradicate drugs.
Eradicate the supply of drugs. Control the supply of drugs. That's the function and purpose of our drug policy. That's what prohibition is. Okay? So the next question is, does it do it? And I would particularly direct you to a previous class in which you discussed MTF. Did you not? Do you know what I'm talking about? Monitoring the future reports Okay? We've talked to over 1 million kids since 1975. And what's the net result? What do they tell us? Yes, sir.
There really hasn't been any change in drug usage other than the purity for some of the drugs has gone up, the cost has gone down, but you don't see any sort of significant decrease in drug usage because of the war on drugs.
Okay, the MTF in particularly, that's good and all correct, but that is particularly the question that they ask on MTF is, how easy is it to get these drugs? Okay? How easy is it to get these drugs? All right, now the response on marijuana has been 85% roughly of the kids say it's easy to get these drugs. And they've been telling us this now since 1975. It hasn't changed. And we had a recent poll in which the kids said 23% of them, I can get it within an hour. Okay. How could you design a system that could produce a worse result? You can't. I mean, now, it's worse than it sounds. For instance, cocaine, which is going to turn out to be extremely important in my talk, because it's important to the drug lords, and because that's what I care about. Okay. The availability in 75 was about 37% of the kids said easy to get. It went up to 47% in 2006. Doesn't matter. If 37% or 47% or whatever, if as long as any substantial portion of kids knows it's easy to get a drug, that means all of them can get it. So the first thing when you're analyzing the question of what you want to do in drug policy, you know, is to say, what have we accomplished? What is this availability of drugs? Because everybody starts with saying, oh, if you change anything, the drugs are going to become more available. All right, now it's also true that in other reports, the government now estimates that over 1 million kids, or it was 900,000 last I saw, between the ages of 12 and 17 sell drugs. Okay? That means well over 1 million teens. You add the 18 and 19, which are the high usage years. It's when we get the huge boost in use, which you've talked about age, I think, 18 to 21. Huge increase in all forms of drug abuse. So you have that question. Now, I'm going to divert for a moment because we're going to be talking about supply, but that, to me, is the measurement of the success or failure of the program. It's not how many drugs you capture. It's nothing. It is the relationship between supply and demand. As long as you have enough drugs to meet the demand, you're saturated. You have totally saturated it. Okay? As long as people can easily get to drugs. And that's been, our kids have been saturated with drugs now for as long as I can remember, starting in 75. A lot of stuff is going to go back to the 70s. Susan may have mentioned briefly that I got my degree in history as an undergraduate from Rice. I always sprinkle stuff in with history because I can't help but think historically. That's just the way I look at a lot of things. Okay. But about the time Al was having his story that he was telling you about his experiences with marijuana in the 70s, I was having mine. And so I graduated from Rice, having started my drug career as an alcohol drinker, like everybody, in high school, and then through college. Okay, and now I go into the Marine Corps, and that's alcohol squared. Okay, so it's part of your job description, and was to drink a lot of it. And I had never in my life seen marijuana. I'd read about it. I knew Robert Mitchum had been arrested for it. Okay, but I'd never seen marijuana. I get out of the Marine Corps and I come back and I go to work for IBM, and in my 30s I decide to go back to grad school here. Okay, so now I go to my first grad school party. Surprise! No alcohol to be seen except for a bowl of sangria punch over the corner in a smoke-filled room. Okay? This goes on for 3 years. Not just here, but I later do some study in psychology at the University of St. Thomas, and it turns out that if you go a couple miles away, it didn't change a thing, whether it was a Catholic university or whatever the hell it was. It was exactly the same thing, just flooded with it. Okay, this, taking aside my personal indulgence, it gave me the opportunity to observe hundreds of people using drugs thousands of times, you know, over the course of 3 years, and comparing it to what I had seen in alcohol-based parties all of my life before. And, you know, the net result, I don't think this is going to come as any surprise to you. The marijuana crowds were pleasanter. They were easy to get along with. I didn't find turned over taxi cabs. I didn't, you know, and things went along. Okay, now, from my perspective, everything that goes on in this whole drug war, its whole purpose, I see things not by their intention, which seems to me a silly thing to look at, but the results of a policy to understand what policy is about. And the result of the policy is to finance your worst enemy. It's to give as much money as possible to the cartels. This does not please me. Okay, I consider them among the most vile, contemptible people in the world. And if you have looked at what has gone on recently, what we have got from, what was the year? 2006, I guess Calderon did his crackdown. Then I really think we've got, this morning's paper said not 18,000, 22,000 deaths since that time in Mexico. Now this happens to include a lot of gang versus gang conflict and a lot of people. But it also includes thousands of people who had no connection to drugs at all. They're innocent survivors of the, or victims of the drug war in this particular cases. It's gone to the assassination of priests who condemned the people in the thing, altar boys who happened to be along with the priest, innocent people while shooting down mayors. It's the biggest source of loss of reporters, except in a war zone. Okay? And so, over and over and over, it's blood, blood, blood. And it's not all blood from there. You have a Christian missionary. Her name is Ronnie Bowers. She's flying in the backwoods across South America. CIA-monitored operation, identifies her as a drug dealer, not a Bible dealer, but a drug dealer, shoots her down, kills her, her infant daughter, Charity, okay? Actually, her husband and her son go down, but amazingly, they lived. It's a little Piper Cub that crashed and was shot down. So on the next thing, Al mentioned I had written a piece about what Susan had talked about, which was, why can't we talk about this, for God's sakes? And it's one thing to have a view of something, but to say that everybody ought to shut their mouth that thinks that there's something wrong with what we're doing is what we were initially doing anything about. And that was one of the first things I wrote about the drug war, which is what. But my first piece after we'd started the forum was about Ezekiel Hernandez, which probably is a name that doesn't register with anybody. And Zeke is an 18-year-old tending goats in his own backyard in a little town called Redford, Texas. 4 Marines in camouflage followed him, saw he had an old single-shot rifle. They couldn't tell what it was. He used it like a kid does that's out in the country. He's in his own backyard, for God's sakes. It's a little country patch, a few hundred yards. And they shoot and kill him. And I wrote a piece for the Dallas Morning News which said, if you don't stop this, it's going to happen again and again and again and again. It's been happening. It's going again. And that's where I'm basically at, and that's what I care about. So that you will at least have a point of reference for what I'm going to talk about. Now, what also then comes to mind is this historically, and you guys have heard a lot of this, but I'll just sum it up. We chose to have these drugs without drug lords. So that if we talk about 100 years ago today, we know that this country had legal cocaine, heroin, and marijuana. They were all over. They were widely advertised by the same people that Susie was talking about, often Eli Lilly and so forth, Bayer Company and whatnot. And the net result of that whole period was that those people did in fact become addicted to some degree, about to roughly the same degree that we see with prescription drugs today. But there were no drug lords. Okay. So now we start coming to, oh heck, I'll just throw this in for free. And I always think, when I think about Johnny Appleseed, somehow he captures the drug war for me. Johnny Appleseed was really John Chapman. And John Chapman was a very clever entrepreneur who was in fact planting apples with the net result of turning those apples into hard cider to sell on the frontier, so alcohol out in the frontier. So the distinction between Johnny Appleseed, as most of us grew up hearing about Johnny Appleseed and John Chapman, is the three things that I constantly find in the drug war. Number one, it's about money. One way or another, somewhere along the line, money gets involved to a huge degree. Secondly, it's about alcohol, not all these other drugs. Okay? And third, it's about fairy tales. Okay? So much of what we know is driven by myth and fantasy and fairy tale, which goes back to Al writing a letter about, oh, you can't compare cocaine and whatnot. It goes to crack babies that either, have you heard that whole bit? I'm sure that, you know. And gateways and so forth and so on, and they get people utterly incensed, and they're insensitive. And this is the part that's so difficult. They're so insensitive to these horrors that go on both in this country, the damage done by the drug war. So the distinction between with and without, we know that there's this huge amount of damage over here that would disappear without drug war. And I've got one little passage here, historical. Susie talked to you about the heroin clinics in Switzerland. So this is from 1919 to 1923 in Shreveport, Louisiana. And here's the situation. A doctor there has devised a way to give clinical morphine and heroin, mostly morphine, but a substantial amount of heroin, to the addicts in Shreveport, Louisiana, in response to the government trying to essentially prohibit heroin at the time. The result is that the federal government comes down and tries to check and see whether they're going to allow that clinic to continue. They want that clinic closed. There are other clinics, but we happen to have great records from this particular clinic. The guy was an amazing person and kept detailed records. So we had the same situation essentially then as we have now with medical marijuana. You don't want to allow medical marijuana because that's going to prove that all this stuff we were saying was fairy tales all this time, that there's no medical value to marijuana. You don't want something to force you to say, I was wrong. That's the one thing you cannot stand to say is, I was wrong. Okay? And you can't stand to take any position that might be in the least risky if it threatens your election. Okay? It doesn't matter what a poll shows. It matters whether you think they'll switch their vote because of the way they feel about the item. So you want to get emotions going on one side and not on the other. Fear sells. Okay, here we are from historian David Musto. Is that on the reading list, The American Disease, Susan? Great book. And by golly, if I don't find the right thing, here we go. This is from the reports that were filed, Musto's summary. Federal District Judge Jack again affirmed his high opinion of the clinic. He warned that he would vigorously oppose any steps taken toward a discontinuance of the clinic because from his own knowledge, it had lessened crime in the city. The city judge was even more outspoken. He particularly favored care of the incurable addict, which enabled him to work and not be a charge to the city. I want to go back to this. I want to repeat this. He particularly favored care of the incurable addict, which enabled him to work and not be a charge on the city. And all I'm saying is the idea that any addict is not functional is highly suspect. Some addicts are not. Okay, but most are. Okay, and this is the whole city saying, yeah, I can handle it. Now, the word in their day was peddlers, but the peddlers disappeared. The drug dealers are gone from the city at this point. The report goes on. Both the chief of police and sheriff said that crimes which might be resorted to pay for illicit drugs had lessened since the inauguration of the clinic. The U.S. Marshal was of the same opinion. So we get the same basic report that Susie gave you, which is crime considerably down from this type of thing, and a relation established. Okay, so when I think of this question, with or without drug lords, and I get this panicked result. As somebody said, oh my God, I wouldn't want to work with a heroin addict. And I said, man, you ever work by an alcoholic? If you know it, that's not a good thing necessarily. Okay. So ultimately, it's about the same time we're doing all this, 1972, National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse is formed by Nixon. I think you've heard about that. And, you know, 9 of the 13 members named by the experts with the consulting and a bipartisan commission. And it worked just like a bipartisan commission should. They ignored politics and gave us the facts. And to this day, for me, this is kind of a mini Bible for me, for what those people said. Because here was the startling look at our drug policy that said, the whole thing you've been doing is based on incorrect assumptions. That you've got this very distorted view that has, and I guess I shall read from my little Bible. Here are some quotes from the Commission. We are convinced that public policy, as presently designed, is premised on incorrect assumptions. The Commission feels that a coherent social policy requires a fundamental alteration of social attitudes toward drug use and a willingness to embark on new courses when previous actions failed. Unless present policy is redirected, we will perpetuate the same problems, tolerate the same social costs, and find ourselves, as we do now, no further along the road to a more rational, legal, and social approach than we were in 1914. So they're taking their historic review based on that. And they follow, drug policy can be thus summed up. Increased use of disapproved drugs, this is noted over here by Matt, and precipitates more spending, more programs, more arrests, more penalties, all with little positive effect in reducing the use of these drugs. Now, what were the things that they were so upset about? A whole series of things. One is they cite the things that Susie was going down. They said there's so many people making so much money, so much profit, giving and dispensing funds, that we are afraid this policy will be there perpetuated. Perpetuated. Okay? This is the increase in spending that they're talking about that occurs between 1965 and 1973, when they were spending roughly 1% of what we spend today. The impact of that money is immense. But their specific problem is summed up all in a sense in 4 words, which says alcohol is a drug. And no amount of semantics can change that and the importance that it functions essentially like all other drugs. And once you understand that, then you have an entirely different view of the world. Drug use is from them, philosophically, a good thing, because drug use does not imply harm. So drug use occurs because, unless you put drug harm or harmful drug use, but if you just say drug use, because somebody gets enjoyment from it. And that is the enjoyment that a free citizen should enjoy in a free society. And that should enhance what it means for individual freedom. Now you begin to move into the problems of what happens when people abuse the drug and do harmful acts to themselves and to others. And their point is that most people never get there. Okay, so that if you want to build a society that reacts well to the problem user, stop wasting all your time and energy on all the people that use the drugs that don't create any problems. Okay, so then their next point is they're going on to say, you have to understand it's not the drug, it's not the specific drug. It's the user, it's the conjunction of a set of circumstances, okay, and particularly it's the dose. The drug itself, if used as designed at an appropriate dosage, is going to have one result. And as dosage increases, depending on the drug, how quickly it happens, you get this whole series of possible negative results that can be up through disaster. So then we come about the same time What they are doing is essentially saying, we're really skeptical that you're ever going to stop the flow of drugs. They're pointing that out. So their first immediate thing, and remember that this is a commission that was expected to rubber stamp the drug war. So they have to be very careful and couched in their terms, and that they were this dramatic says a great deal to me that they could do it. This is headed by Governor Schaefer, a known opponent of drug abuse, etc., a strongly anti-drug guy. And as I say, so many named by Nixon. But the implication there is we'd be better off if marijuana were to disappear. And because we think it may be a fad, all we're going to say is don't put people in prison for it. Okay, we're not going to say no prohibition, but for goodness sakes, don't put people in prison. And so they recommended decriminalization, but they have a passage in there which says, however, if it becomes in the culture, okay, then we have to reassess and consider whether there's anything to be gained from its prohibition. But these basic principles then go on. Here we go. So this is data that we're going to look at from substance abuse and mental health services. What we'll try to do is say, how does a lot of this correspond to what we know about drug abuse today? And I think I can just do that. Oh, I thought I could. Oh. I think. No, I think I gotta get this thing. There I go. Did I get it? Yep, it's up there. Hot dang. Okay. Light switches give me a lot of problems. And what I want to do first here, this happens to be a chart of the use of the prominent illegal drugs over the past 8 years. And all I want to emphasize with this chart is to look how flat the lines are. That the lines are essentially the same. The top line is you're looking at total illegal drug use. First of all, note that marijuana makes up so much of the last, but that it's flat essentially. And down here we have cocaine and pain relievers. And the bigger point is that that's it. Those are the illegal drugs that cause nearly all addiction in the United States. It's alcohol plus these three: marijuana, cocaine, and pain pills. Nothing else contributes by as much as 2% to the total addiction figure, which I can show you, first of all, by specific drugs, okay, in which you see this relationship and how small the fifth largest tranquilizer, larger than methamphetamine or heroin or whatnot. And what you can see then is that, therefore, as we consider this, if you're talking about the total problem, which I think we can go back to here, what you're looking at here is the total number of people that are classified by the government with dependence or abuse. And you'll note once again that the figure at top, which is 22 million, winding up at 22.2 million and varying around that number, is there. And there are a couple things I want to suggest to you that are very interesting about that. Does anyone have any observation about this fact that here we are with 22 million people in 2002 and 22 million people with problems in 2008? Come on here, let me get somebody different here. Freddie, what do you think?
I mean, from looking at that, there's been really no big change.
Yeah.
In any of
But what inference can any of us draw from that? That's what I want to know. Here's the inference I draw. It is that it means, since this is a period in which we have over 50 million new drug users, that for every person who has a problem with drugs, as they come into the system, somebody's recovering. You can't keep the system static unless there are no new drug addicts. Or, we know that's ridiculous, for everyone that's developing a problem, they're basically getting out of it. Now, I can go on to other charts here, and we can compress it, and we can do it with age, but what we're basically finding out is we have this huge influx in drug abuse up to 21, and this huge decrease by 25, and then a gradual decrease out to about 34, and much tougher to deal with. But the point is, the biggest problem happened before they were 21. This all got set in motion before we ever got criminal offenses involved. And here we've got all these people getting involved with prisons and drug dealers and whatever problems they get in bed with, and we're trying to save them when the natural course of events is going to get about half of it through what nobody fully understands, what they call age, maturity, the development of an interest in a positive life and their life commitments and after 20 and so forth and so on. So we're sitting here fighting a problem that is largely self-corrective. And so we're back at the same situation where, yes, we do have people who are persistent, do have people, but, and you've also had a class where you've also had a class on dual diagnosis. These are very difficult and complicated cases. And once again, why are we targeting 300 million people when we could be targeting 300,000, 1 out of 1,000, and doing a better job if we could focus on the most difficult cases? So the essential question that I ask audiences all the time is, do you really believe that a drug dealer is going to be more conscientious about keeping a drug away from your kid than a doctor in a clinic or a person who's trying to protect a commercial enterprise? Is that a difficult question to answer? Now, let's assume that first of all, you have enough other data so that you know that kids are going to experiment with drugs whether we like it or not. Now, of course, most of it's marijuana, but it's also the highest level of experimentation with all the other drugs. That drug is going to be 10 times as dangerous as it would be if it came leaked somehow out of a legitimate system. So that we...
Somehow your microphone did a dive off of the... Something sounded funny. I'm hearing your feet more than I'm hearing you.
Okay. Here's the mic.
Yeah, that's it. Keep going. Keep going.
Now.
What do you need to back up to?
A whole lot of
How far does that
Did you catch me quick?
That's fine. That's fine. That's good.
All right. So what we also see from the same graph is that 5 out of 6 cases are alcohol. 5 out of 6 public cases are alcohol. And what we find out, and most of you have your attitude about marijuana, and I'm kind of presuming most of you are like what is becoming a majority of young people who would just as soon see it legalized. I think you have very different ideas, many of you, about a drug like cocaine. Let me at least point out the role that cocaine plays. Because I'm not adept at all this, we'll just go down here to cocaine as the 4th leading source of problem use. But that's out of a total of 37 million people who have tried the drug. Okay, so that I'm looking at what is approximately and consistently, once again, consistently, 1.5 million problem users roughly from 2002 to 2008, as compared to some 18 million with an alcohol problem. Okay, but there's a kicker, and it's a huge kicker. Have you gone into comorbidity with alcohol abuse and other drugs? In a major study done by NIAAA called the NESARC, N-E-S, it doesn't matter. The net result of it all is this. Nearly everyone who has a cocaine problem is an alcoholic at the same time. At the same time, they have a dual drug problem, or perhaps more. Okay? It is very hard to find somebody with a cocaine problem that doesn't have a major alcohol problem at the same time. Okay? It's even true with marijuana to a lesser degree. But over half, according to NIAAA, of people who have a problem with marijuana are alcoholics. Okay. And so what you eventually get down to with any of the other drugs, the drugs like ecstasy, are really minimal social problems. This LSD is a minimal social problem. However, whatever you may have heard, study it a little bit and you're going to find out that neither of those drugs make much. If you rate social disorder as the essence of your problem. And so you get back to this cocaine, and that means that in essence, if you accept the premise, which I hold, there's another story coming out of my grad school days I'll get back to in a second. My premise is that marijuana is going to be legal within 5 to 10 years. I think that it's in the cards. I don't see how this time it can be overcome, but we have to fight to get it there. And there's going to be a real reaction. But I have found in some of the polls that Susie cited that if you have used marijuana, 2 out of 3 people think it ought to be legalized. And the prevalence of marijuana being tried in today's society is getting so high, and it is so inherently hypocritical for people who use alcohol to feel this way, that I think that's going to happen. However, this was very similar to what I predicted when I was in grad school, right after the commission report that I talked about came out, and there were some things. So there are a lot of fights to go on. So I want to, also, golly, this is really a tangent, but I remember now that Dr. Robbins wanted me to say something about the political nature of DPFT, or more specifically the non-political nature. We did not know each other, many of us, or we knew very little about the politics. We never knew or cared, and have since found out that Dick was a rock-ribbed Republican at the time that this was started, and Al has gone from a little bit of here to libertarian to a little bit here. Susie, I guess, is more of a Democrat, I think. That would be accurate. The whole point is that we're all over the spectrum. I also ought to point out to you, if any of you have been keeping up with the Tax 2010 initiative that's going on that's in California, that's proposing legalizing drugs, that is spearheaded by about $1 million from a guy who wandered into our first meeting over at the Health Science Center, who we didn't know, who was in a wheelchair, Richard Lee, and that's the name you see now on TV all the time, or in the articles, Richard, and Richard's parents are rock-ribbed conservative Republicans. Okay. So we try to get our inroads into that area of the court, because they've obviously watching. Richard became paralyzed in an accident involving construction, and the only relief he actually got was through marijuana. It's the one, and they, as you know, there a lot of damage can be done from heavier drugs, and this threat to the pharmaceutical company if you can reduce the intake of the more dangerous drugs and so forth. So that's another little aspect to throw at you. There's a wonderful speech that I would recommend to you from 1842 from Abraham Lincoln. You can get it sometime, but the essence of it is to talk about addiction in the alcoholic. And it is in essence some of the things. It's quite a long speech. It runs about 12 or 13 pages. But, or to say that this whole question, I'm coming to vulnerability, which is very key to me, and I want to talk about it for just a second before I quit. But Lincoln said he understood the gnashing of teeth and the horrible things that happened to the families and the barroom father and all of this sort of thing. He said, but it is my judgment that those of us who do not have a problem have been mostly spared from absence of appetite. Absence of appetite is that we don't get any intellectual or moral credit for resisting something that was never very tempting to us. Okay? What's the big deal? Okay, so then he was saying, interacting with people, that if you try to do it through force, they will close all the avenues of their head and heart, you know. And in his more dramatic form, he said, let me see if I can possibly get this right. Though your cause be naked truth itself, and you fashion it into a spear, and you throw it with more than the force of Hercules, you are no more going to penetrate their consciousness than if you try to penetrate the hard shell of a tortoise with a shaft of ryegrass. Just saying, it is not much in the nature of man to be driven to things, to be driven to things. And he said, if you would help them, you must first be their sincere friend. You have to take them where they're at. And this whole concept of what's going on with the clinic in Shreveport, whether it's Shreveport or Switzerland, and the same thing spreading around, and Canada's begun to start one, somebody's got to say to them, and what I did initially in those clinics is, you may have as much heroin as you want. Nobody's going to stop you. Go ahead. It's free, and take as much as you like. And the net result was less heroin use after a period of about a month of readjustment and so forth, when they understood all the heroin in the world is not going to make me change myself. It's not going to solve my problems. You know, all this fantasy, whatever it was that they had, is just, it's not there. Now, you've established some sort of relationship of trust between the person who's interacting with that person. I mean, after all, so many people, we know the histories of sexual abuse are one thing, and all sorts of trust issues raised in homes that would be horrors. So much of vulnerability is an accident of birth. So that if we start looking at these, let me see if I can pick the one I sort of like here to display that. The most significant figure to me in this particular graph is the one that doesn't show at all. It's the inverse. We're looking at 22 million who consistently have a drug problem, which are nearly all alcohol problems. What it doesn't show is 91% of the people in the United States who do not have a problem. They have used alcohol. They have used pain pills. Many of them have used marijuana. Some of them have used coke. But they don't have problems. Now, I don't want to get into all the myriad ways that people become protected from or vulnerable to, but yeah, this is the same pattern that you could have established back in 1900 if you'd have just looked at, okay, these other drugs are sort of like prescription drugs, alcohol is the big problem, and most of us don't have a problem. These were in medicine cabinets all over the United States. Okay? And so, I just think we have way too much faith in our own ability to avoid the pitfalls of drug abuse. And even if you are vulnerable physically, you have a different orientation that tells you to be cautious, to control your dosage, to control the circumstances, etc., etc. And if you don't have that, and you are in a path for a problem, we're dealing with it all the wrong way. My God, am I supposed to say, okay, you were raped as a child, so you went out and you ran away from home, and now you're selling heroin. I know how to fix that. We'll put you in prison. This whole chain of events could have been changed dramatically if they'd just been accepted into some situation when they showed a problem and they had access to it, if we spent the money on that. Okay, well, we'll have a lot of time on the panel, and it's been fun talking to you, and thank you very much. Oops, if I run off with this.
No, you got something in your pocket.
Well, you probably want the whole thing. God, Dick, you're so unreasonable. Here you go.
Thank you, Gerry. Thank you, Susan, for inviting me. I'm going to do like Al. Mine's going to be kind of short and just more personal. I got interested in this back in about 1989. I read an article in the journal Science. It was written by Ethan Nadelman. He's now the the director of the Drug Policy Alliance, one of the leading national spokesmen on this, this subject. And it was about 7 pages long, and like all those articles, it was so logical. Every paragraph after paragraph was just like, this all makes such sense. I was on the program committee for the Rotary Club of Houston, and I asked around. I said, where can I find somebody who might be willing to talk on this subject? And somebody gave me Al's name. And this was back in about 91, I guess. And I went to Al. He was still the chairman of the department. And he thought about it for a while. And then I got a call. Well, he didn't think he was quite ready. So it was kind of the political environment then. But then I got a call from him. It was time to start the organization. And we've been really have loved the activity. We still meet. We still have board meetings once a year. And I mean, thanks to people like Susie and Gerry that are really doing all the real work, we are making some progress. I said I'd say a word about needle exchange programs. Have you all talked about that? You've already talked about that a little bit? Well, I was just going to give the summary. I mean, basically, they've been around, I guess, what, 20 years or so. The concept is very simple. You exchange needles with heroin addicts, and though on the surface it looks like a bad idea, if you think about it, it's a logical thing. It keeps the dirty needles out of the parks and out of the streets and brings them where they can be safely dealt with, and that prevents the spread of the disease from person to person. I'll tell you the anecdote that we got involved in this back during the Lee Brown administration when he was mayor. The three of us, everybody except Susie, went down to City Hall. We talked with we had a representative from the mayor's office. We had the chief of the health department. We had the chief of police, Bradford, who of course now is on city council. Anyway, all of them were African American, and we were not. And I was making the point: look, this problem with AIDS and all, is not not a gay problem that much anymore. It's really devastating the black community because of the heroin use in those community. And we were there for over an hour. I know I got 2 parking tickets, which the chief of police refused to fix. But anyhow, because we kept talking on and on. But in the end, all we got was a list of all these things we needed to do. Well, you need to do this. They were talking to us. And the bottom line of it, of course, of the situation was that the chief of police was willing to not arrest people that were doing these sorts of things. But we had a district attorney, Johnny Holmes, who at the time was very conservative, had somebody, mistakenly been picked up and put in custody, and the DA's office had picked up on it. That would have been a big problem. So we ended up not doing anything, and we're now with a new mayor and a new DA. We're with possibility we might look at it again. But as far as I know, there are programs, and I think they're going on in Dallas and San Antonio, Austin. These are all supposed to be underground, so obviously they aren't advertised very well. But anyway, that's enough on that. I will say on the medical marijuana thing, Susie did a good job, I think, in pointing out the illnesses that it treats. And Richard, that's how I met Richard. He was one of the first people I'd ever met back in '95 who actually used it. The problem he has is the paralysis. So he has spasm in the muscles of his legs. Even though they can't move, you wonder how that happens. Well, I'm not sure I know either, but that's the one medicine he can take that really helps him. And of course, as I think Gerry alluded to, he's now gone. He moved to Oakland, California, and went to a small sort of rundown section of Oakland, and started opening, along with others, opened up coffee shops, and they've sort of named this region of Oakland Oaksterdam, after Amsterdam and Oakland, you see. And Richard is now the mayor of Oaksterdam and doing very well, and is the leading proponent of this issue, which I'm sure we'll all be following. I think the Secretary of State just recently announced that enough signatures have been collected that it will be on the ballot in November. Let me say a couple things about kids. One of the big criticisms that we get a lot, or I hear a lot, is, well, it's the kids. You got to focus on the kids. You have medical marijuana and that kind of stuff, greater access to marijuana. The kids are gonna smoke it. Susie and I were just talking about the Dutch experience, what's happened in that country since they opened their so-called coffee shops with making marijuana legal. Is the use of marijuana among the teenagers or the kids in Holland is plummeted. I mean, it's less than half among those kids of what it is in the United States. Someone said that they've succeeded in making marijuana dull and boring. And the same thing, Susie said, has happened in Portugal when they did the same thing, that the use among kids has gone down. you know, in this country, it's easier for, as Gerry said, that's our favorite quote, is over 85% of kids can get marijuana easily, and it's easier for them to get marijuana than it is to get alcohol. Art Smart is one of our members of our organization, and he loves to tell a story about going to rock concerts and, you know, coming up to some little 16-year-old kid who's got a bag of grass and say, hey, listen, I'll trade you some grass for a couple of beers, you know. So it just shows you what a paradoxical situation we're in. The Shreveport experience, I'm glad you got to talk about that. That was very important. I guess I'm going to kind of wrap up here because we want to have some time for this discussion. Panel discussion. There's one quote that I think that I've heard Al say over and over, and that is the business of, well, why is it taking us so long to get beyond this war on drugs? I mean, we did the same thing earlier in the 20th century, the exact same thing with alcohol prohibition, and it only took us about 13 years to realize how insane it was. And I guess Al, I don't know if you're the observer that made this, but anyway, I hear you say it a lot, and that is that the people at that time, they had a memory. They all had a memory of what it was like before that was the 19th Amendment, whatever the amendment was that passed that prohibited alcohol. And they remember what it was like, and they could see how much worse it was getting. So the time it came around in the early 30s, there were enough people that could, you know, get on the bandwagon to support the repeal of that amendment. So with that said, I think we'll just bring it to a close and have a panel discussion. Take a break.
We are on the air. Okay. I'm speaking for the Drug Policy Forum of Texas and appreciate the invitation from Dr. Robbins to speak with all of you. And what I particularly would like is to encourage you to think about anything that we might have said that bothers you, that you think maybe I have questions about that. I don't understand that. That may be wrong. I have different ideas. Would like to hear how you react to those things. And before I turn it over to you to start probing, and you might also want to know what the actual political climate has been. There's been a dramatic change since we started the forum, and how much we had to do with it, I don't know, but we've had a hand in it. And so there are a lot of things happening. There's a very, very different atmosphere present about the willingness of people to examine this issue now. And we see it very dominantly changing in the media, but there is so far to go, but much advanced over where it was. Anyhow, before I do that, one of the things Susan had asked me to do was to speak briefly about the question of whether or not drug policy alters drug use significantly. I think we touched on it, but I want to say just a few things about it that we see from the statistics. And people seem to, well, we've talked about the fact that it can't be availability that makes a difference because the drugs are available. What we need also to talk about is we've talked about youth being the time of maximum youth and experimentation. So the question is, what do we learn from looking at the statistics of that use? And the answer in very crude terms is about 80% of the kids use alcohol. They break the law to use alcohol. Ergo, the law doesn't seem to stop them, just as it didn't during alcohol prohibition. For those who would argue, yeah, but it's legal and that makes a difference for adults. First of all, I would point out that may make it more attractive to certain people, and rather than not, since that's a period of rebellion. But what we know is we have these three prominent drugs, one of which is marijuana, that is used almost as much as alcohol. There is a study from NIDA that says on an average day, from the ages of 12 to 17, the number of people using marijuana is about 93% of the number of people using alcohol. Okay, but at any rate, one of the points about just talking about marijuana is the problem of spreading usage is almost non-existent because the usage is already so high, and there has to be a certain number of people who just don't like smoke. And so, and I don't really believe that, and that those people who have never used alcohol are much of a threat to use the other drugs because of any change. So you can see it in the ratios of drugs to alcohol. Now the second thing that's really dramatic is that number that was 93% for marijuana shrinks to around 2% for cocaine. Okay, and it shrinks to less than 1%, well less than 1% for heroin. And if you look at lifetime use, we have about 37 million people that have used cocaine, broken the law to use cocaine, and 90% of them have never tried heroin. So attitudes are not being shaped by legality, their assessment of the drug. Similarly, 96% of the people that have used marijuana have never tried heroin. Something like 2/3 of the people that have tried cocaine have never used. Have used marijuana, have never tried cocaine. So those are three very widely different responses, and whatever the reasons are, it's not legality, because they're all equally legal and punishable under the law. Beyond that, what a lot of people don't understand is surveys have been done in which we talk to people who first used a drug 2 years ago. Okay, first used it in the period between 1 and 2 years ago. And then they're asked, have you used the drug in the past year? And it turns out that the only 2 drugs that are not rejected by a majority of people, they've tried them and rejected them, given them up, never touched them in the last year, are alcohol and marijuana. And the marijuana dissipates with age. It's close and goes off considerably. Most people who try crack cocaine, it's the highest rejection rate I've seen at least, just don't like it. Most cocaine users won't try crack. Okay? All right, so we see that going on. And all I'm saying is people are making judgments based on what they think about the drug as a drug and what they experience once they try the drug. Most people are just simply not interested in trying cocaine or heroin. The number that have tried it lifetime for cocaine is about 15%. I think it's around 2% for heroin, something like that. So they're very small numbers, and that's so much different than the reported 50% of young people, which I think is much higher actually for marijuana. So with that little background, any questions that any of y'all want to add a little something that's occurred to you? We'll respond to you, please. Ask us something, Allison.
I think it was our last speaker who said that talking about prohibition and how people had the perspective to realize very quickly why it wasn't working after only a little over a decade. Why is the same not true, say, 13 years into the drug war, that people who were around still had that perspective of what it was like before and after? Was it because the laws were so gradual and it wasn't as strict a cutoff as the alcohol prohibition?
Well, first of all, it's an interesting question. My belief is this, and this is purely speculative, and this is my assessment of what happened. Alcohol was always the target. Alcohol was the big focus. You cannot imagine. People were required, the textbooks had to have large sections on alcohol and tobacco back in the 19th. This whole thing about alcohol raged for a century. Now what I've told you is that if we went back to 100 years ago, we would see a problem with the other drugs roughly equivalent to the drugs that are prescription drugs. This is a huge social conflict. The country, alcohol is the most popular drug in history. The country wanted to get rid of that. I think there were so few people using the other drugs that there wasn't a constituency. They had to focus on getting rid of an amendment to the Constitution, which people thought was impossible. It was a single focus. It was one that affected the entire country. The prohibition of the other drugs had been slipped in almost without notice in 1914. The Harrison laws were not designed, most people think, exactly as prohibition laws. And in fact, there were battles in the Supreme Court that last all the way up to 1929 at least. So I just don't think it was a big enough deal to enough people. They, give them their whatever. Give the guys that hate drugs, this group of drugs, give us our alcohol. That's my belief. I don't know.
Well, I think it's more just a simple case of the fact that alcohol prohibition, the whole purpose of it was to make everything better. In other words, that was the stated goal of it. The saloons would all go out of business. The fathers and husbands would come home to their wives instead of wasting all their money in the saloon on the way home. And another thing was that everything would be better because men wouldn't drink. There would be no alcohol to drink, and so the quality of life would go up everywhere.
Absolutely.
But the fact is, though, 14 years later, they could all see, far from everything being better, everything was worse. Because you had Al Capone, the murder rate, I mean, literally everything seemed to be much worse. And it's true that the drug problem in 1906 or 1900 was non-existent, basically, for reasons that one or another you guys talked about. But you can't. Nobody could remember. But that was everybody who knew that is dead.
So now that's true, but
yeah.
She was asking, I think, why that didn't all happen at once in 1933. And I think it's because there were two totally different systems of legislation involved. One was the repeal of the Amendment. I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, this was the Anti-Saloon League. I mean, the temperance unions. They didn't give a damn about those other drugs. They were
Well, I've always said that they cut it off at the roots, but the tiny root that they never thought or dreamed would grow, now has sprouted. But anyhow, excuse me, man.
Well, I was just going to say that, I mean, the question, what occurs to me is that this drug war, I mean, which really got, I mean, the drug laws go back to 1914 or the 1930s for marijuana, but when you really see it started to get enforced, when people are spending time in jail, it's very targeted. The poor and especially minorities. And I think that's how it crept up on everybody, is because the people that it was overwhelmingly affecting in a negative way, directly, were throwaway portions of our society, people who didn't have a voice.
That's a good point as well. Eric?
I think we now talked a little about Big Pharma and the massive amount of lobbyists that they sent to Washington because of their, I guess, their vested interest in the drug war. I was just curious of why they're not jumping on the gravy train of legalization and maybe not. I'm sure they would stand to benefit greatly should they legalize marijuana, and they're the actual ones that are selling it like they would psychiatric drugs.
No, they can't patent it. They can't patent the drug. THC is not patentable. And that's where they make their money, as you know. They get a 17-year period of time when they can make a lot of money. So it's almost all immediately the generically available drug, which is something that they're not going to get any money off of.
And another thing is you can grow marijuana in your closet. You don't have to go, well, unlike the other drugs, with the right set of grow lights or in your backyard. It's something that is accessible to everybody or anybody who wants to put the effort into doing that. And therefore, it's much harder to control. We cannot make the pharmaceutical grade drugs that they're trying to get us to use instead. Whereas anybody can grow marijuana.
It is, however, I still think part of the reason that, for instance, Marinol gets approved or whatever is that, you know, they can control it. They can make profits from such drugs. And so this whole matrix of things that goes together, and I think Dr.
We hadn't talked about Marinol. Marinol is a legal oral form of THC, which is a much, when you take marijuana orally, first of all, Marinol is a much lower dose than most people need, and the effects cannot be controlled as easily as they can when you smoke it. Because I think we talked about this before, that if you ingest something orally, when it starts to hit, you're stuck with the full effects, whereas people can self-titrate or self-regulate how much marijuana they get when they smoke.
And it's not as effective. It's just one of the opioids that's in marijuana. Marijuana's got lots of different opioids, and you talk to people on chemotherapy or a variety of different reasons for taking those drugs, Marinol is just not any good, basically.
There's another answer also. Get me on this. Is it who's Sativex? Is Bayer? Is that who bought the German rights? Was Bayer? Yeah. Sativex is the newer drug, an advance, we'll say, on the whole drug from Marinol, and they're playing both sides of the fence. Their companies bought the distribution rights to Sativex, and I suspect that Sativex will get approval here a lot more quickly than natural-grown marijuana will, because of all the things that Dr. Robinson's talking about.
Let me say one thing that I forgot to mention in my brief remarks, and that was having to do, once again, with kids. A study was published last fall looking at the 13 or 14 states where marijuana has become more or less legal. for medical purposes. I say 14 because I think that one of the states there hadn't had enough time for him to really do the study. But in all the states in which, again, they were asking questions of the same group of kids, it's the 8, 10, is that right, 8th grade, 10th grade, 12th grade. And the questions was, what has happened to the use of marijuana in each state since the laws were changed? And in every single state, the use of marijuana among all age groups had declined over what had been earlier before the laws were changed, and it also had declined greater than in the other states in the Union that had not changed their laws. And all the changes in every state were statistically significant. Now, they weren't huge numbers, as you pointed out, but they satisfied a statistician.
And there are multiple studies, and Dick's pointing to a very good one and probably the dominant one, but there are others that don't show quite that dramatic increase, but the same general pattern. We don't see any. There was no increase, and there were slight decreases in those states. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I was kind of still, I actually had a very similar question. I guess even if they couldn't get the patent rights on marijuana or whatever other drug, wouldn't the savings of paying the bukus of money on lobbyists and making even minimal amounts of profit on what anybody could get easily be more cost effective for the pharmaceutical companies than fighting it?
No, I don't think so at all. By far the largest group of drugs that the pharmaceutical companies sell now are mood-changing drugs, and they're hugely profitable. And besides all the competition with the drugs that they sell for illnesses, which probably that would not be significant competition, although it might be. I really don't know. But the competition with their mood-changing drugs, which is their main profit center, would just be staggering.
So it's that they already have, they're putting drugs in the market that do similar things as the illegal drugs, and they don't want competition in that.
That's
okay.
right.
If it turns out that, as we've seen, there are a lot of indications that marijuana is going to, for instance, help with PTSD. The New Mexico, where they have just recently made it legal, the major number of applicants to that patient program are PTSD patients.
Yeah, their largest group is vets returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, and their second largest group is rape victims.
So what would, it seems like all of you are suggesting that we might be approaching something of a tipping point when it comes to legalization. So what are some of the elements or some of the things that you guys think we would see going along with that tipping point where this policy might actually shift, the drug war policy?
Well, we think, first of all, the easiest thing to do would be to legalize marijuana, because as Gerry said, that's by far the largest of things consumed of illegal drugs. That represents the biggest amount of money and users as well, and would have in the least harmful effect. We kind of debate from time to time about what to do about cocaine and methamphetamine and heroin and some of those, but the easiest thing to do is what California, I hope, is getting ready to do, and just make it legal. I'm sure you have more to say than about that, Gerry.
I do, but so does Susie.
I'm not too sure what you're thinking of. I think one interesting aspect of what's happening in California is that since Richard Lee wrote the initiative, he was familiar with the crazy liquor laws that we have in Texas that give every little community control over whether they'll have it or not. He wrote the initiative so that it would be local option in California. And I think that will make it more palatable to the voters. And should we have legalization of any of the drugs that are illegal now, I think that it would probably be at a minimum on a state-by-state basis, and more likely on a locality-by-locality basis, the way that Richard has written the initiative about marijuana.
I think that's a real important point. It just generally, the concept, in 1982, the National Academy of Sciences had the only other National Commission on Marijuana. And they spent a great deal of time in that finding saying, if you will let one state do it, it becomes low risk, it becomes an example to find out what's good or bad about it, and, you know, everybody benefits, laboratory democracy, it's right inconsistent. Well, of course, that's the mechanism by which alcohol prohibition was ended. But that whole concept of we have a good friend who's involved with law enforcement against prohibition, and he is a lobbyist in D.C., and he finds a lot of receptivity when he visits all the congressional offices to the concept, to a conservative Republican, to say, isn't this a states' rights issue? Shouldn't we forget whether you like it, good, bad, or indifferent? Just, isn't this a states' rights issue? So that may be the most promising direction of things. The Webb Commission, Susie, you want to say anything about that?
Well, Senator Webb from Virginia has proposed that a commission be established to study, in general, I think it's the prison system. But since so much of the prison system is related to drug policy, it would certainly encompass studying drug policy. Because not, 52% of federal prisoners are drug prisoners, but certainly many, many more are there because of some crime that's related to distribution of drugs. And the same for states. You know, it's a small amount of people that are there for the drug crime, but then they've committed other crimes to get money or in some capacity as a distributor. So if this is approved by Congress, which hasn't happened yet, but he's a powerful senator, then that will be a huge step forward as far as educating the Congress and educating the American people as a whole.
Yeah, Matt and I had a little conversation out here during the break, and I was pointing out that in the polls we find out that in the states that have medical marijuana, the vote for legalization is higher than in the states that don't. And I think one of the reasons for that is in that whole run-up, there was a lot of education that took place in the debates, one side or the other. So I think this concept of education is important. I think there are 34 senators now are co-signers on Webb. Good. Okay, so we're getting fairly close to that. And the bigger point, which is when Al and I first met, you couldn't get a media person to scratch this or talk about it. You know, you gave them a piece of information and they didn't want to hear it. Alcohol pays a lot of their advertising revenue, and there's a lot of people also that were livid about the whole idea that you could talk about that. Well, this crisis on our border is changing things. The whole debt situation is changing things. States are looking, some states. And mostly what happens is a lot of people are looking for cover. So I could always say I opposed it, but now that you've made it a states' rights issue, oh, I guess that's that dominant, okay? It's cover. Oh, I wouldn't want to make that drug legal, but boy, couldn't we use that money. So, you understand. So, people are generating excuses that were not we could walk into an office and have people explain the drug war pretty well to us and say, don't think I'm going to say that in public. You know, they're not going to do it. Good man in the back that takes care of us.
Where you were going with the rationale behind only punishing users that were truly abusive to society, and in Mr. Epstein's portion of your talk, I mean, it was what I got out of that. We were saying that, okay, you shouldn't really be putting in prison the people that were, not truly a threat to society, that were not, grinding down. So, I'm overstating that, but grinding it down. It sounded almost as if you could have substituted the words "gun" and been listening to the NRA. As in, you shouldn't be punishing the people that are not abusing guns.
That's an excellent parallel. An excellent parallel. Some of us have thought that we could have, maybe the framers should have put an amendment in the Constitution, like the Bill of Rights, like they have for guns. But the logic has been, well, Washington, Jefferson, all those guys, it was just they're groaning on their farms. I mean, they didn't need any constitutional amendment back then for their ability to do that.
Yeah, well, it gets dicey when you start crossing boundaries and deciding what's general. But as a matter of fact, there are a group of people out in the United States who are drug reformers who make it a real point to talk to NRA people and gun reform people. So again, politics makes stretch bedfellows sometimes and all that sort of thing. So people, we look for alliances anywhere we get. Dr. Robbins.
Yes, if in fact we move, as you're suggesting, Gerry, to local areas rather than full states, or even states' rights, what is to prevent the federal government, as they have done consistently in the past, when states do pass laws that they're not happy about, what is to prevent them from coming in with federal regulations or federal drug busts? And I'm thinking particularly about one of the big things that they tend to do when the federal government doesn't like state policy, they threaten to hold back money. Until all states went to the drinking age of 21, they were under the threat of losing federal highway money. How do we solve that problem when the federal government still has a very strong grip on monies that states get, and they can threaten to withhold that money if they don't toe the line with federal ideas?
Take a wiser head than mine.
We need to repeal that amendment that allowed senators to be voted by popular vote, whatever one that one was, because what happened there was the state legislatures would elect the senators to go to Washington, and they had an allegiance to the governing bodies of their own states instead of selling the states out as they do now.
Yeah. Flora, what do you think?
The people.
I can use my phone.
You said earlier about the climate really changing. Were you referring to the whole thing in California, or do you mean like the state climate? Because if it is state, what is it?
National media, I think, would be the biggest thing I would point to, Flora, is that I can see these programs on Fox, on CNN, on ABC, NBC, CBS. The stories that they're covering are the same sort of stories we tried to get them to do in '95. They wouldn't listen. They had no interest. And now the fact that these are stories, the editorial boards in different newspapers across the country are modifying their stances. Some are very strong, some are, but they're shifting, they're moderate. And we can count these, you check them out across the board. It's just, there's a whole, you take El Paso, that's a crisis for those people over there. People are being murdered there all the time. So suddenly things, for whatever reasons, and I'm sure there are multiple reasons, it's just a totally different atmosphere than the one we worked in, although we still hear the fairy tales an awful lot, and there's not been I still write many letters to people across the country who write stories and tell them, look, that was a good article and thank you, but could you put a sidebar that just put this facts, just this very small set of facts in front of the American people. American people, I talk to a group, and if I tell them that alcohol is 5 out of 6 cases of drug abuse and addiction, they give it that, and then they start to wonder, well, why? I mean, the drug war is almost irrelevant to the drug problem. Okay, that makes them think a little bit. Ashley.
Hey, my kind of question, thoughts, oh, I'm sorry. I'm still getting used to this at the end of the semester. My thoughts and question kind of evolves from what Matt was saying, what Don was saying. I think we all agree that yes, there's a tipping point. You've all kind of mentioned that there's kind of an edge, and you kind of see a future where there's a more positive outcome for different types of drug legalization. But I'm wondering, when does it, like, what's the marketing strategy? What's the marketing package that will take this movement from all those crazy yahoos that they just want to legalize drugs, from that to, hey, here's the education that you were referring to, getting in and all the different implementation venues. But I guess that's what I'm asking. What's the marketing strategy look like?
First of all, you're asking an excellent question that everybody in the reform community is struggling with, all these things. But I will tell you this much. If you see a representative from most of the organizations, you're not going to see long hairs and et cetera, et cetera. You're going to see people dressed very nicely with ties, and they're going to speak softly, and they're going to. It's a totally different attempt to present the information. You're going to see a lot more professors and doctors' titles and that sort of thing. Okay, and we've got groups that feed them people in their areas who are experts on fields. They may or may not accept them, but they at least know that there are people with very good professional credentials that are responsive to whatever the particular aspect of the drug war that they want in there. The contrary views, well spoken from an expert on the field, if they're presented, see, there was only one microphone. There was only one megaphone, and it was always in the hands of either a policeman or a politician. Now you get two faces. Okay, and the marketing strategy has always been just please get us to the point where we can get the second face on to say, no, what this guy's telling you is not accurate. Okay, so that's very broad, but that's an attempt to answer it. Yes.
Two more questions.
Can I make a plug for Dean Becker's show on KPFT? He has a daily show. It runs about a couple of minutes long called somebody will tell me the name of it. It's a radio show. But the important point I wanted to make, he's been doing this now for several years, and the important point I wanted to make was that the Baker Institute of Rice University is now going to be sponsoring this program, which is a big plus for him.
Yeah, it's all they're going to archive. The part of the point Dick's making, Dean is, by the way, on our board of directors also, and he comes from a much different background, more vociferous and whatever. But Dean is talking to experts. There are audio files of hundreds of shows with people from all around the world that have made the news at a particular time he's talked to them. It's a very interesting archive that's going in at Rice.
Two more questions.
Well, if nobody has a question, I think there's one thing that you probably all know, but we just haven't mentioned tonight, is that the only drug that decreased in use during the drug war is tobacco, which was never illegal in this country. And for the vast majority of the time that the drug war has been going on, tobacco is subsidized by the government. And Gerry uses a different, he talks about alcohol with his groups. My Rotary groups, I talk about tobacco.
It's an excellent point. By the way, as much problem as we've talked about alcohol having, we're still making improvements with alcohol, and a lot better than we do with a lot of other things. Or certainly we're doing okay. But the dramatic one in our lifetime is over 50% reduction in tobacco use. And we grew up in the day where everybody around us was just curtained with smoke. If you've ever seen the TV series Ad Men, it's a great watch. But all the people in their offices with clouds of smoke is kind of funny. Mad Men, I guess it's called, on 57. Yes, Ashley. Last question.
Okay, good, because it's the last one I had.
It's a good thing.
Yeah. When do you think these great ideas that are being utilized in Europe, harm reduction, what kind of future do you see and implementation in that being used here in the United States?
Well, it's a great question, and it is one of the pushes. And the heroin clinics are one of the things that we talk about, and this whole idea of generally going from less use of prisons and more use and more tolerance. That's showing up. We're seeing decriminalization measures across the country. We're just at the bottom of the chain and very slow. And as we get surrounded, and as Canada, which is also tough, but nonetheless more advanced than us, simply because they've got a drug czar essentially that's in the medical community rather than a policeman. And as changes are just happening south of the border, I think we're gravitating slowly in that way. And on behalf of all of us, let me invite you to our website and to thank Dr. Robbins once again for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you all.
Very much.